Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. This is gonna be the last episode in my Menshevism series. The topic is who were the supporters of the Mensheviks. Sometime in the future I'll probably make a video about the dissolving of the Russian Constituent Assembly and also about the Izhevsk-Vatkin's revolt, but for now this basically concludes this series. Okay, let's get to the topic. Let's examine who the supporters of Menshevism were. From previous evidence, we already get the sense that Mensheviks received support from the petty bourgeoisie and non-workers, even from previous factory owners and managers. Brovkin himself says that Mensheviks and SRs had their strongest base in smaller, more rural provincial towns, which, quote, unlike larger cities, where tens of thousands of workers were concentrated in huge plants, were dominated by merchants, handicraft shops, and trading peasantry, unquote. In other words, more petty bourgeois areas, and the Bolsheviks had always claimed that the Mensheviks were a fake workers' party, that they were in reality a petty bourgeois party. However, as examples of such cities, Brovkin mentions places like Tver, where according to Smith, the Bolsheviks won the elections in 1918, and Kaluga, where the Mensheviks dissolved the Soviet in 1917 because the Bolsheviks won the election, so even there the Menshevik support doesn't seem very firm. According to Social Democrat Price, quote, the Mensheviks were supported by the brain workers and by the privileged working-class aristocracy, which, however, thanks to the very small development of craft unionism in Tsarist Russia, were an almost negligible factor in the land. The Bolsheviks were supported by the greater part of the skilled workers, by the sailors, by that section of the poorest unskilled laborers who were not under the influence of the middle-class intellectuals, and by that section of the soldiers who had the courage to stand up against their officers. The socialist revolutionaries represented the middle and upper layer of the peasantry, a section of the poor peasantry as far as they were politically conscious at this period of the revolution, the profiteering middleman, small proprietor, the professional man of the countryside, and the simple careerist, unquote. He mentions that a lot of careerists supported the right-SRs. A lot of other sources have also mentioned that a lot of people who weren't really even socialists, but were more like liberals or even conservatives, joined the right-SRs, so I'm guessing that's what he means by careerism. In their highly significant work, Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, Sidney and Beatrice Webb write, quote, the Mensheviks, the Bundists, the separate organization of the Jewish workmen, and the social revolutionaries mainly represented the non-industrial unions and the small urban centers. Of the industrial unions, the only one which constituted a firm bulwark of the Mensheviks was the Printers' Union, unquote. And capitalist historian Hatch writes that, quote, if there was a labor aristocracy in Russia prior to the revolution, then printers were its best representative. Perhaps more than any other working-class group, printers, in their small-scale work environments and with their guild-like solidarity, were imbued with the pre-industrial values of an artisanal elite. They worked in small companies, their labor environment was of a smaller scale than that of most other industries, unquote. And Feiges writes that, quote, the print workers with their high rates of pay and their close ties with the intelligentsia were the most likely candidates for labor aristocracy emerging in Russia, unquote. And capitalist historian Koenker writes, quote, typesetters, that is printers, highly skilled urban workers, were notorious for setting themselves apart from other workers and often rejecting participation in a wider labor movement in favor of helping themselves, unquote. The fact that the most labor aristocratic section of the workers, the printers, were the firmest support of Menshevism cannot be a coincidence, although I'm not entirely sure how the printers reached such a privileged position. I know that they had some common interest with the capitalists. For instance, when the Bolshevik government banned private advertisements by the capitalists, the printers opposed it because that meant that they would earn less money. When the Bolsheviks wanted to suppress capitalist newspapers which were publishing counter-revolutionary lies and calling for violence, the printers also opposed that, because that also meant that they would get less money. Maybe they earned higher wages because the capitalists considered them a particularly crucial section of the workers. The fact that they were more politically backward and conservative was also contributed to by the fact that they worked in very small workplaces compared to factory workers. That's why they considered themselves sort of separate caste or separate craft, divorced from the rest of the labor movement. They were still somewhat on the level of pre-capitalist sort of handicraft guild organization. According to Hatch, the Mensheviks also had more support among the older, more conservative skilled workers who earned higher salaries, who were not happy with the relatively more egalitarian wage policies of the Bolsheviks. They wanted higher wages for themselves and not for others. The Mensheviks' other support base was mainly the chemical industry, because it had, quote, a large number of clerical and technical workers, a substantial number of more skilled, well-paid male workers, whose difficulties were compounded by the worsening conditions in the industry caused by the social and economic disruption of the period. To an extent, the same also applied to some workers in the armaments industry. The worsening conditions in some industries, like the chemical industry, were caused by the war and of course were only temporary and accidental. In the armaments industry it was the opposite. Armaments factories were closed when the war ended, which caused some unemployment and dissatisfaction, but of course that was also temporary. But the more firm reason why there were more Mensheviks among segments like the chemical workers was, of course, because they were privileged, and a larger amount of them were officials and not actually factory proletarians. According to Hatch, in the chemical industry, quote, well-paid, skilled male workers in the rubber industry, interested in defending their relatively privileged economic position, much like skilled printers, dominated the union and supported Menshevik trade union politics, and the existence of large numbers of traditionally liberal or social democratic, clerical and technical workers in the chemical industry helped to reinforce the Menshevik grip, unquote. However, eventually, even in the chemical industry union, the Mensheviks lost their popularity to the Bolsheviks. The Menshevik newspaper, Civilisation claims that the Mensheviks were defeated in the union by Bolshevik sabotage and repression, but Hatch quite correctly writes that, quote, the claim made by Civilisation may have been at least partially self-serving. In times past, the communists had successfully mobilized worker support, unquote. At the Chemical Workers' Union conferences, quote, the pro-communist bloc was almost exclusively composed of delegates representing large and medium enterprises. Nearly all the delegates from the small enterprise employee category supported the Mensheviks, unquote. It's worth noting that the pro-communist bloc consisted of workers, while the Menshevik delegates consisted of employees, meaning white-collar people. From the information provided above, we see that the Bolshevik supporters were more proletarian, they were more collective and disciplined, while Mensheviks were more petty bourgeois, more labor aristocratic-minded, and those who earned higher wages. Elsewhere, Hatch says that the Menshevik workers were more craft-conscious, that is, supported only their own craft or their own section, and not the class as a whole, and not even the industry as a whole. Craft unionism is an older and more backward form of unionism, and derives from petty bourgeois medieval guilds. And obviously, the reason that craft unionism is bad is because it separates workers into smaller groups, or rather it is a relic from an earlier time. It is a relic from the time when the workers were not yet formed into a united class. Workers who are truly class conscious consider themselves as members of their class, not only members of their industry, and certainly not only members of their craft. It's better to have all industrial workers join together, but ideally you would even have all the different industries and all the different branches of the economy work together. So you would have industrial workers, transport workers, retail workers, farm workers all unite as a class. The Mensheviks and SRs also held some positions among the railway workers, and even though their strongest support was among the book printers, their position in the railway union was probably the most strategically important. Anti-communist Leonard Shapiro writes, quote, VIXL, that is the railway trade union, was composed of three groups, a pro-Bolshevik and an anti-Bolshevik group of about equal size, and a third non-party group said to be pro-cadet or pro-capitalist. The anti-Bolshevik strength of VIXL was, however, considerably neutralized by the fact that, as events soon showed, it failed in many cases to enforce the decisions on the rank and file of the railway workers, unquote. I've also seen some sources describe the groups in the VIXL as being Menshevik-SR and Bolshevik. Here it says Bolshevik, anti-Bolshevik, and capitalist. In any case, all the sources say that VIXL was originally split pretty evenly among these warring groups, and that the anti-Bolsheviks controlled most of the bureaucratic positions, whereas the rank and file were more oriented towards the Bolsheviks and tended to support the Bolsheviks. But in the end, that didn't really matter because the VIXL was simply replaced by a new railway union anyway, which went over to the Bolsheviks. The extremely anti-communist historian Feiges agrees that Menshevik supporters and members were mostly petty bourgeois, but he makes the absolutely ridiculous argument that, quote, the Mensheviks were more genuinely democratic, both in their policies and in their composition, than the Bolsheviks. They tended to attract a broader range of people, more diverse types of workers, petty merchants and members of the intelligentsia, whereas the followers of the Bolsheviks tended to come from a narrower range. The vast majority were great Russian workers and uprooted peasants. This broader social base may partly explain the Mensheviks' inclination towards compromise and conciliation with the liberal bourgeoisie. It is truly the epitome of anti-communist logic to claim that a workers' party is undemocratic by definition because it includes mostly people from the working class and poor peasantry, while a party which includes more property owners, intellectuals, and non-proletarians of all kinds, and collaborates with capitalists, is democratic because it supposedly appeals to these other classes too. But a supposed workers' party, which panders to all classes and also even to the capitalists, only loses its character as a workers' party. A property owner party cannot be democratic. Hatch also says that Menshevik workers were older and more conservative, while Bolshevik workers were younger, and he also cites a source according to which Mensheviks received votes in elections also from previous factory directors, that is, from actual bourgeois who had been ousted from their position, which of course makes perfect sense. Of course they would vote for Mensheviks, why would they vote for the Bolsheviks? Feiges also writes that, quote, Bolshevik activists in the factories tended to be younger, more working class and more militant than their Menshevik or SR rivals, unquote. So Feiges is not talking about their supporters, he's talking about their actual party members, or at least activists, party member or otherwise. During the worst years of the Civil War, the Mensheviks and right-SRs tried to weaponize the discontent of the most backward workers. Victor Serge writes, quote, hunger riots began to multiply and anti-Semitism reared its head again. Even at the Puddle of Works, an SR speaker shouted out on 8th of May, let's throw the racial slur for Jews into the Neva, get a strike committee going and stop work. The best elements among the workers were away fighting. Those in the factories were precisely the less energetic, less revolutionary segments, along with petty folk, yesterday's small shopkeepers and artisans who had come there to find refuge, unquote. Hatch states that the higher vote for other parties such as Mensheviks in places like Sokolnichesky Soviet, where the Mensheviks still only received as little as 4.5%, was due to, quote, the large number of white-collar workers employed in the district, unquote. And he also says that the Mensheviks apparently received some help from left oppositionists in the Bolshevik party. Finnish communist leader Sirola wrote during the Civil War, quote, to defeat the enemy one needs courage, courage and more courage. To the revolutionary poor masses, Marx emphasized this golden rule of Danton's, and the communist vanguard of the Russian proletariat has shown by its numerous previous struggles and by its remaining in the ceaseless fire of the revolutionary period that it has taken this rule to heart. But when the struggle becomes protracted and more stubborn, we must remember also another slogan, resilience, resilience and more resilience. That is what the revolutionary people of Russia need most of all, because the current half-year, spring, summer, autumn, is the period of its final test. During this period, the decisive events will take place. Tenacity, resilience, is now being asked of the proletariat, which is loyal to the revolution to its very core, because there are groups whose faith is wavering. They are those who don't understand the laws of war, but imagine that already in the course of the battle, the fruits of victory should be in their mouths. Such are part of the peasantry and petty bourgeoisie, who say, "We've had enough, let us be satisfied with this, let's not fight any longer." They do not understand what wage workers have learned in the school of countless strikes, that to abandon the fight halfway means to lose everything. It is impossible to remain here, firstly, because this is not any kind of utopian situation, and secondly, the enemy won't allow us to remain here, but smashes into pieces the foundations of everything we've laid down if we relent even for a moment. There are even some groups of wage workers who have a petty bourgeois mentality and who do not see the toiler class as a whole. Such splitting mentality is seen, for example, among railway workers. So the Moscow Pravda tells us that in that region some groups of railway workers have held meetings where they shout bread and even threaten to strike. In organizing such things, certain engineers, officials and other petty bourgeois elements have been very active. They whisper provocational rumors and incite the less thinking elements to scream. They rely on demagogy, the irresponsible incitement of unconscious elements. They don't explicitly incite against the Soviets themselves, because they know that even the most conservative groups of workers don't accept that, but they take advantage of temporary hardships for splitting purposes. For example, now the bread supply has diminished. After all, large battles are taking place on the fronts, and the new harvest hasn't ripened yet. The conscious workers remember last year and know the situation was worse then. It looked very grim, but we survived it. And now it is only a past hardship which has only steeled us. As we won last year, now we will win better. But not everybody has the strength to think like that, and there the counter-revolutionary provocateurs strike. They scream bread, though it hasn't even ran out yet. Additionally, the railway workers have certain privileges compared to other workers. They have, for example, been excluded from military service both during the World War and the Civil War. That was the reason for the so-called patriotism, social patriotism of some of their groups. Even during the Civil War, the railwaymen have enjoyed the same privilege, and now that they are asked to join in carrying their part of the burden of military defense, it arouses grumbling in some parts of their group. That must be overcome. In the revolution, what is at stake are the interests of all working people. What is at stake is the progress of the whole country and people, all humanity. Splitting that front is the blackest provocation imaginable. The working class cannot allow it. Towards all splitters, individuals and groups, it acts just like it has gotten used to acting during strikes towards strike breakers, and those cowards who constantly whine that we will never succeed, let's give up. Unquote. Sirola perfectly understood exactly the reality of the situation, the scale of the difficulties, but also the strength of the workers, which would triumph despite the cowards and traitors. As the workers abandoned the Mensheviks, even the best Menshevik activists and minds abandoned it and joined the Bolsheviks. Quote, "The most revolutionary elements left the Mensheviks in large numbers, in groups and individually, and merged with the Russian Communist Party." Unquote. Georgy Chicherin joined the Bolsheviks in 1918. Ivan Maisky did so in 1919. Vyshinsky went from Menshevism to Bolshevism in 1920. The famous philosopher Deborin also left the Mensheviks and later joined the Bolsheviks. Troyanovsky joined the Bolsheviks in 1923, as did the Menshevik leader Martynov. Martynov, quote, "came to the conclusion that the Menshevist conception of democracy and dictatorship is a saccharine babbling of persons who do not know what is going on in the world, that it is just parlor theory. Some say the Bolshevik dictatorship is a regime wherein a minority imposes its will by force on the majority." Martynov answers, that is wrong. The Bolshevik dictatorship is a regime of force by the revolutionary classes and layers of the population over the unrevolutionary classes. Unquote. Quote, "The leftist group of Mensheviks who wanted to collaborate with Bolshevism was led by O. Urmansky, B. Ber, Andrei Vyshinsky, and O. Domanevskaya." Unquote. However, just to clarify, this is not to be confused with Martov's group, which also called itself left. It was actually centrist and anti-Bolshevik. According to Brovkin, quote, "Many Mensheviks defected to the Bolsheviks in the spring of 1920. Martov lamented that defections had acquired the proportions of a flood. L.M. Kinchuk, the former chairman of the Moscow Soviet, who had denounced the Bolshevik seizure of power at the Second Congress of Soviets back in October 1917, Ivan Maisky, former CC member and Minister of Labor in the SR-led government of the Constituent Assembly in Samara in 1918, and many other prominent old-time Social Democrats now switched to the Communists, unquote. Menshevik Dalin also writes about, quote, the Social Democrat Internationalists, Lozovsky's group, who went over to the Bolsheviks in 1919, and similar groupings. Among the important figures on the left, besides Urmansky, were Boris Baer, the Kharkov leader Ivan Akhmatov, also in the Ukraine, later in Siberia, and Andrei Vyshinsky, who became a member of the Menshevik extreme left in 1919 and eventually a Bolshevik, unquote. According to Volin, quote, it was a major blow for the Menshevik party when two members of its central committee, Troyanovsky and Urmansky, defected to the Bolsheviks in the spring of 1921, unquote. He also says that G. Gonickberg broke from the Mensheviks in the 1920s and returned from emigration to the USSR. Menshevik Sapir also writes that even after World War II, quote, in 1947, Menshevik Yugov in effect went over to the Communists, unquote. It is actually interesting that even after World War II there was some polarization in the Mensheviks, because some of them started to claim that the USSR had become fascist, while others decided that it was finally time to just admit that they were wrong and just join the Communists. Sapir continues, quote, many prominent Menshevik members withdrew from political work or went over to the victors, for example M.S. Ralabanov, F.A. Bolkin, V. Galuzin, K.A. Gvozdev, B.I. Gorev, V.G. Groman, D. Zaslavsky, O.A. Urmansky, V.M. Korobkov, I.M. Maisky, A.S. Martinov, A.M. Naumov Ginsburg, A.A. Pleskov, I.A. Rubin, S.U. Semkovsky, A.I. Troyanovsky, A.M. Fischgendler, L.M. Kinchuk, A.B. Stern, intelligenti and workers of the Menshevik right and left, all these and all the other old Social Democrats who left the party must be taken into account in assessing the loss in potential replacements for disappearing leaders. Far from all these defected out of fear, some were honestly disappointed with Menshevism, and the best were attracted by the seemingly limitless opportunities for applying their talents to the reconstruction of the state, unquote. Quote, Lev Kinchuk, a prominent Menshevik defensist at the Second Congress of the Soviets, found that he, quote, could not sit with arms folded while the proletarian revolution was going on, unquote. Kinchuk left the Mensheviks abruptly and, to their utter astonishment, published a statement affirming that he had been long disappointed with Menshevism, unquote. Only the miserable traitors and idealists, liquidators and social imperialists like Potrasov, petty bourgeois waverers like Martov, and dishonest frauds like Dan remained Mensheviks to the bitter end, though never firmly or with principle, but always wavering and scheming. They emigrated to the West, where they collaborated with capitalists and white guards, bickered amongst each other, lost all support and contact with the masses. Brovkin writes, quote, Martov wrote that the Menshevik party experienced more defections to the Bolsheviks in the fall of 1918 than ever before. The Mensheviks were undergoing a profound crisis of identity. Their efforts had led to the consolidation of reactionary forces that had only used the socialist-led protest movements for their own advantage, unquote. Anti-communist historian Smith writes that the best members of the right social revolutionary or right-SR party also eventually joined the Bolsheviks. Obviously, the left SRs joined in huge numbers. The left SRs had had an alliance with the Bolsheviks almost since the very beginning of the October Revolution. After the leadership of the left SR party tried to overthrow the Bolsheviks, the majority of the left SR membership still sided with the Bolsheviks against their own leaders. The left SRs split basically into four groups: the anti-Bolshevik left SRs, the Narodnik communists, the revolutionary communists, and the SR maximalists, and the latter three groups all eventually joined the Communist Party. However, even the honest and revolutionary-minded among the right SRs decided to join the communists. Anti-communist historian Smith writes that, quote, late in 1920, a party delegation to the Urals discovered that there were only a handful of SRs still active in Ekaterinburg. The author of the delegation's report explained that most of the SRs and former SRs, quote, have in a majority of cases attached themselves to Soviet institutions and try with all their efforts to make not only others but themselves forget that they were ever SRs, unquote. And, quote, a few SRs such as Vasily Sukhomlin, even joined the trickle of post-war returnees to the Soviet Union, unquote. According to the Soviet State Security, or GPU, by the mid-1920s, most of the liberals who had pretended to be SRs had abandoned politics while, quote, most real SRs had left the party long ago and are not carrying out any party work. In the vast majority of cases, they have already reconsidered their previous ideology and long since become Soviet. And at a Congress of SRs in 1923, the dominant mood was, quote, forward into the ranks of the Communist Party, unquote.